Hello again. So after the moves d4, d6, knight f3, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7. Here the main moves are e4 and g3, but they'll be covered in other chapters. And in this chapter, we're going to cover all the other options for white in the seventh move. And we have bishop f4, bishop g5, e3, and h3. First of all, bishop f4. This has a similar idea to bishop g5. It's a solid setup. White wants to continue with e3 and so on. Bishop e2, castle h3. And here, I like this move bishop f5 with the idea to go knight e4. Castle is also possible and most likely will transpose to the London after e3, knight bd7, h3, b6, bishop e2, bishop b7. This will transpose to the London. But bishop f5, why not? Similar idea to the lines with g3. White is just continuing the development now with e3. And now it's important to trade this knight with knight e4 to open up the dark square bishop. White has to take on e4, otherwise we take on c3 and double the pawns. Bishop takes e4. And bishop d3 to trade this bishop on e4, which is very active. Knight d2 is not so good because we can play bishop f5. The knight is misplaced on d2, and here we have this idea to push e5. So bishop d3. We're happy to trade the bishops. Bishop takes d3. Queen takes d3, castle, castle, and knight d7. And we're happy to reach this position with black. Apparently white has a bit more space, but we exchange two pair of pieces, and it is black who has the breaks here, so we can play either c5 to break the center, or we can consider e5. With objectively the position is equal, but there is still a lot of play. Going back. Then there is bishop g5. This is an interesting sideline, mostly played to avoid the mainline theory. White wants to continue with e3, bishop e2, castle, and so on. And this is recommended by Grandmaster Adrien Demieux in his course, The Solid 1d4 Part 2. So, far from surprising us, we are going to surprise the players with white by going bishop f5. This is a rare sideline. It was not analyzed in the course mentioned before by Grandmaster Adrien Demieux. And the idea is clear. We want to stop e4, and at the same time, we are preparing knight e4. Here, okay, e3 is the main move. There is also knight d2 and maybe queen b3. Knight d2 is a logical move. It stops e4, and white wants to go e4 himself. Now we can chase the dark squared bishop with h6, bishop h4, g5, continuing to chase the bishop, bishop g3, and knight h5. Next, we can take the bishop and play c5 in order to activate our dark squared bishop. Okay, of course, white first needs to defend the d4 pawn. So queen b3 has to be taken into account because we move the bishop away from c8, and the b7 pawn could potentially be a target. However, it turns out that white is lagging in development and cannot afford to take the b7 pawn. This was tried by Mamedyanov in a blitz game, but it's not a good idea, especially if black replies with strong moves. c5 is the most precise, just ignoring the threat on b7 and threatening to open up the position. And here, queen b7 is not a good idea, but let's say this is white's principal move to take the pawn after playing queen b3. But after knight bd7, the queen is exposed and black has a great lead in development. Actually, white is in big trouble here. So queen b3 is not good. e3 is the most natural move, just continuing the plan. But we play knight e4. So this is very similar to the line with bishop f4. It's the same idea. We are trading these knights and opening the dark square bishop. White has to take on e4, otherwise the bishop on g5 is under attack, and also knight c3 is an idea to double up the pawns. So knight takes e4, bishop e4. And again, it's good for white to trade the bishops with bishop d3. We're going to see bishop d3 and knight d2 as well. Knight d2 trying to chase the bishop away from its active position, but we can go bishop f5. Now, e4 is not a good idea for white because then d4 pawn will be weak. Bishop e2, just continuing the development. Castle, castle. Here white wants to play maybe f4 to take control of the center. But we can play h6. Bishop h4 is good. Note that bishop f4 is a bad idea due to e5. The bishop is completely misplaced on f4. So bishop h4, g5, bishop g3, and we played all this in order to get knight bd7, and then after e4 the bishop will be able to retreat to g6. So after knight d7 we completed the development. We have useful moves like c5 and even bishop g6. Black has a good position and white is not able to take advantage of this slight weakness with h6 and g5 because we have the bishops that cover our king. So bishop d3, white is trading the bishops, and now bishop takes d3. We're happy to trade one more piece. Queen takes d3, castle, castle, and knight d7. Okay, so here both sides finish the development. Position is about equal. We have, again, the idea to go c5 or to prepare e5 after, let's say, queen e8 and e5. We can go for that. At the same time, we need to be careful about white's idea to go queen e4 with a double attack on e7 and b7. But queen e4 doesn't work right now because of queen c8 and white can take on e7. For example, queen e7, there is rook e8, or bishop e7, again, there is rook e8 and the bishop is trapped there. So this was bishop g5, and I like this solution with bishop f5. Let's see e3 here. What's the point? Of course, e4 looked more natural, but e3 is not a bad move, and white is trying to play a reversed king's Indian attack setup. The plan is very simple: bishop e2, castle, and then push on the queen side, b4, bishop b2, and so on. Here we can castle. It's too early to go bishop f5 because of bishop d3, and white can go for this in one move. So we wait for white to play bishop e2 first. Castle and then bishop e2. What happens if white goes bishop d3? Then the bishop will be exposed there after we prepare e5. So we can say, let's say, go rook e8 and prepare e5 and d4. And the bishop is rather exposed on d3. So bishop e2. And here bishop f5, it's interesting to go for the same idea with bishop f5. To jump knight e4. Of course, it's possible also to go knight bd7. But this is some other setup to play in King's Indian fashion, knight d7, castle, and e5. But bishop f5, I like this idea, especially when we can implement it in different setups. Here we can see castle, which is the most natural move, or even knight d2 to stop knight e4. Okay, so knight d2 prevents us from playing knight e4. And white can even consider e4 at some point. It comes with tempo. The knight is misplaced on d2 though. So knight d2. We can go e5. Of course, if white allows it, we go for it. And then d5 is the only logical move to play for an advantage. White is seizing some space. Now we go a5. We want to get our knight to c5 via a6. e4, bishop d7. Of course, the bishop is developed on d7. And now white is rerouting this knight to f1, knight f1, to open up the bishop, and he wants to bring the knight to g3, knight a6, g4. It makes sense to seize some space before going knight g3. And white is preventing us from pushing f5 later on. c6, we want to open up the game. Knight g3, of course. Here we can open the position with c takes d5, e takes d5. It makes sense to keep the c5 closed. And now knight c5. Black got a nice position in Royal Shreyas versus Thibault in Nova Gorica 2022, but in the end, white won. Now the white king is not so safe on e1. Also, it's a strange position because white doesn't have the pawn on e4. And we have ideas to go e4 here. And I also want to mention here the possibility of knight h4 hitting the bishop, but black can just go bishop d7, and obviously the white knight is misplaced on h4, while the bishop on d7 is developed. Okay, so castle is the main move, going for quick development, implementing the easy plan. And here we go, knight e4. Of course, this was our idea with bishop f5, so we want to trade this knight and open up the dark squared bishop. White probably has to take on e4, otherwise we want to take on c3 and double the pawns, which is not good for white. So knight e4, bishop d4. And now there is knight d2 and knight g5. So either way, white wants to attack to dislodge our central bishop. Knight g5. This looks very active for white, but actually the knight can be exposed here on g5. It's not supported. And bishop c6. I think it's important to keep the bishop on this long diagonal, because if we go bishop f5, white can just push the pawns e4, bishop c8, and f4. So pushing everything. So we can avoid this with bishop c6. Now, for example, if white goes b4, we can go b6, and the bishop can fall back to b7 later on. So the main move is d5. White is trying to seize space here. But this opens our bishop, our dark square bishop, and also gives us control over important squares like e5 and c5. Bishop d7, and then later on we can go a5, knight a6 to bring the knight to c5. We can challenge this pawn on d5 with c6 in order to open the c file and so on. And I think black has a very good position here, especially since the bishop on c1 is lacking perspectives, and also this knight on g5 looks misplaced. So knight d2 is the more restricted way. Now I prefer the bishop to f5 because that idea with e4 doesn't work anymore. The pawn on d4 would be weak. So white may as well expand on the queen side with b4. But now we can attack these pawns with a5, trying to create some weaknesses on the queen side for white. And also, after this, white will have less control over the c5 square, which is a critical square. b5. This is the only way to keep the structure intact. But here we can immediately put pressure on the white center with e5. Let's say bishop b2. And now rook e8. Black has a comfortable position. We can take e d4 or even knight d7. I mean, knight d7 we can't because of e4, but first we can take on e4 and then to play knight d7. We need to be careful to always have squares to retreat this bishop in case of white, if white goes e4. But this is a good position because we managed to exchange one pair of knights. And also we have active pieces here, so I like black's position. Let's go back. And now let's see h3. h3 is a good move, but who would play h3 in a practical game when they can play, let's say, e4? So white usually goes e4 first, and then he's thinking about h3 and so on. So this is basically against our plan to go bishop g4. After h3, bishop g4 is not working anymore. And white still wants to continue with e4 and get king's Indian. Here we can go knight bd7. This is the move we're recommending in order to get a quick e5. If you're a king's Indian player, of course, you can castle. This is very natural. But after e4, there's this system with h3. I also used to play it a lot with white. Of course, it's very complicated. So if you have this in your repertoire, this is possible. But knight bd7 makes a lot of sense to me, since white committed very early on to h3. And now, since we don't want to develop this bishop anymore, it makes a lot of sense to push e5. Here, okay, e4 is the main move, but let's talk a bit about bishop f4, which can make sense since h3 can be a useful move in this setup. White doesn't want to play e4 anymore, but instead e3 and get a London setup where we have the knight on d7 and we cannot play bishop f5 anymore. However, we have an easy plan here. Just go castle, e3 and b6. It's good to fianchetto the bishop, and bishop e2, bishop b7, it transposes to the London. The idea is, of course, to go knight e4 once again. But okay, e4. And now we go e5. This is the point of our play. We want to challenge white center straight away. And here white has several options. Bishop e3, d takes e5, g3, and of course d5. d5, I think, is the most principled to just gain some space. Let's see bishop e3. This move is possible because white played h3 and is controlling the g4 square, so there is no knight g4 for us. And white doesn't want to close the center just yet. However, here we can open up the position, and afterwards we're going to target the e4 pawn. So e takes e4, knight d4, and castle. The idea is to go for a quick rook e8, target the e4 pawn. And white included h3, and then it looks very weird to play f3 with h3 included. Because if white will have to play f3, then there will be some weaknesses on the dark square. So here we're going to talk about bishop d3 and queen d2. Queen d2 is an interesting approach. White wants to castle long and then launch an attack on our king. Here we can go c6, and the plan is to go for a quick d5. Of course, we can include rook e8 first. Long castle. Now it's good to activate the rook with rook e8. White has to go f3 here. If bishop d3, we can go knight c5, attacking the pawn on e4 and also attacking the bishop. So f3. But you can see that now the move h3 doesn't bring white any benefit. So basically it's just a waste of tempo, but he got this very dangerous setup with f3, e4, c4, and long castle. Okay, now it's time to open up the position before white has time to consolidate and push on the king side. We don't want to see those pawns rolling on our king. E takes d5, c takes d5. And here the position is sharp. Black has enough counterplay. We have this plan to go queen e7, attacking the bishop on e3, and then take on c4, opening up the position. Then the knight can jump to um, b6 and so on. And here, if white takes on d5, we're not losing a pawn. We just go knight b6, and then we'll be able to take on d5. Also, if white goes for the tempting bishop h6 to trade the bishops, it makes a lot of sense. We can take, and then again go queen e7 with idea knight b6. This is an unexplored position, but I like black's chances here, especially since white played this h3 move. Again, I have to remind you, it's very unlikely you're going to see these lines in practice, because who would play this move order with h3? Let's go back. Bishop d3, this makes sense to put all the pieces in the center and overprotect e4. White wants to go short castle, and then maybe rook e1, queen e2, rook a d1, and just saying, okay, I have very central pieces, so I'll get an edge. We need to act quickly, and we want knight c5 we go. We want to play rook e8 and then target the e4 pawn. Castle, and then rook e8. Now e4 is under attack, and white needs to defend it, so f3. This looks ugly, but it's possible. I mean, white played h3 and weakened some squares here, but on the other hand, now there is some grip in the center, and we want to avoid this grip. That's why we go c6 here, preparing d5 to open up the center straight away. Black is doing fine. A sample line could be rook e1, d5. Of course, after d5, the position becomes very sharp suddenly. And white has some tactical trick, knight c6, bc6, bishop takes c5, d takes e4, bishop e4, knight e4, rook e4, otherwise b2 is hanging. And now bishop f5. Black has good compensation for the pawn here because of the bishop pair, and especially the very strong bishop on g7. This was bishop e3. Then there is g3. Of course, g3 is possible, but it's a bit weird to go for this line like this with the pawn on h3. Now we don't have this idea with bishop f5 anymore, of course, but we have we're not lacking interesting ideas. And we are offering this very interesting novelty bishop b6 with idea to go bishop b7. castle, and then just take on d4. Bishop g2, castle. We need to castle anyway. Castle and bishop b7. So we're attacking the e4 pawn, and we're forcing white to take a decision here. And here we covered queen c2, rook e1, and d5. Queen c2, white tries not to close the center, and this makes sense. But now we need to take on d4. I mean, we don't want to play rook e8 because the d5 and then both the rook on e8 and the bishop on b7 would be misplaced. So that's why we take on d4, knight takes d4, and now rook e8. Now the threat is to take on e4 because the knight on d4 is hanging. White can, of course, defend the knight with rook d1. And now we can put more pressure on the e4 pawn with knight c5. And okay, the question is how to defend the e4 pawn. f3 has to be played, but this looks ugly, but it's possible. And actually, white wants to go bishop e3, bishop f2 here. Queen e7 is a good move. And this is stopping white from playing bishop e3. If bishop e3, then d5 is possible. One idea is to go c6 and d5 here. There is another idea to go knight fd7, knight e5. Again, quite a new position. This happened in Sonny's Warmerdam, played at the Budapest Olympiad 2024. Black lost, but he had a great position in this game. Rook e1 is possible to defend the pawn on e4. Now we can take on d4, and it's important to remember this move, but once you remember this move, black will simply have no problems. Knight d4, and then rook e8 is a good move to further attack the pawn on e4. In these situations, we need to also be careful because white is threatening or could have ideas to go e5. Okay, right now it doesn't work, this e5, but we always need to take it into account. But rook e8 is very good. Bishop f4, where else to develop the bishop? I mean, if bishop g5, there is h6. Bishop f4. And white's idea is to go queen c2 and rook ad1. And here I like very much black's move, rook b8. Very deep prophylactic move. Well, of course, the rook has no perspective on the b file, but we protecting the bishop on b7. And we're stopping white's plan of queen c2 and rook ad1. Because now if queen c2, we can take on e4, bishop e4, and bishop d4. And you can see that the bishop on b7 is defended. I just want to mention here that it's premature to go knight c5 because of queen c2, and then the tactics to take on e4 don't work, and if white manages to get the rook on d1, then will be under pressure. You can see here that white managed to get a grip, and with both rooks on e1 and d1, it's very comfortable position for white now. So that's why rook b8 was important, and knight c5 is our next move to apply more pressure on e4 pawn, and white is not able to go for the queen c2 and rook a1 plan. Okay, this was rook e1. Now let's see d5. It's a very principled move because we have this bishop on b7, which is going to be misplaced after d5. At the same time, white is seizing space. However, I have to mention that in the structures, the bishop on g2 is misplaced as well. Knight c5, we attack on e4 first of all, queen c2, and a5. It's important to secure this knight on c5. Of course, we're not going to leave the bishop on b7. We want to play bishop c8, bishop d7 to bring the bishop into play. Then move this f6 knight away to h5 or e8, and then push f5 in the future. And the position is unclear. This bishop on g2 is defending the white king, but somehow is lacking perspectives. And I like black's chances here, especially if we manage to push f5. This was g3. Now let's see if white takes on e5. White cannot even trade the queens here. So this is not a very ambitious approach. White is trying for some symmetry. D takes e5. It is also possible to go knight e5, but then more pieces will get swapped. So d takes e5, bishop e3. Of course, the bishop is well placed here, especially since white included h3 and he's controlling the g4 square. Castle, bishop e2, simply developing the pieces. c6. Now these are typical moves in the position we want to restrict this knight on c3. With c6 we are controlling the very important squares d5 and b5. Castle, queen e7, the queen is well placed here. Queen c2. And here you can see that because white played this pawn on c4, we have good play on these weaknesses on f4 and d4. So knight h5 gives black a comfortable position. We want to go knight f4, creating some threats, and then later on knight c5, knight e6. And if white is trying to stop us from going knight f4, for example, knight g3, then there is knight c5 when the h3 pawn is hanging, and we can even break with f5. Obviously, black has a good position. So this d takes e5 is not an ambitious move. Let's see d5, just gaining some space. Knight c5. We're attacking the e4 pawn at once, and it's important not to allow white to go bishop d3 and bishop c2 to defend the pawn. Queen c2. So here we can see the advantage of our move order because white was not in time to play bishop e3. Normally afterwards he could go knight d2. But now, of course, knight d2 doesn't make sense because the bishop is on c1. So queen c2, castle. We managed to disrupt a bit white's coordination, and now we are proceeding with development. Okay, here bishop g5 is the main move. G4 is also there, but b4 is just bad. Let's start with g4. White is stopping knight h5. If, for example, bishop e3, this is also possible, but then we can continue knight h5, castle. And here it's good to play b6, first of all, to secure the knight on c5, and then we can push f5. So in these positions, if we manage to get the knight on h5, I really like it, because whenever white goes g4, we can jump to f4. So this is good for black. But let's say g4, stopping our idea of knight h5. c6. Now, since white expanded on the king side, we want to break the center. We're not in a hurry to take on d5 here, but first we want to go bishop d7, rook c8 first, and then we'll be able to take on d5. And the real test of the line is if white is playing b4, trying to drive away our knight. But of course, in this line, we don't go back knight d7. We can just take knight takes e4. Actually, it was possible to take with the other knight as well. Knight f4 was possible, but it leads to the same thing. So knight e4, knight e4, queen e4. Now we can include this c takes d5. White has to take with the c pawn, because if he takes with the queen, then there is e4. There is this double attack. Fantastic position, isn't it? Knight d4, and then rook e8. Very strong, and this is bad for white. Okay, rook e5 is a threat. And you can see white white is a piece up, but his pieces are not coordinated at all. So white is forced to take with the pawn on d5. f5, of course, we need to act quickly here because we are a piece down and we cannot allow white to regroup his pieces. So f5, white has to take, bishop f5. Now we're developing all the pieces. But still, I mean, material advantage is in white's favor. He's a knight up or a pawn. Queen e3. Otherwise, we go e4 anyway. But like this, white wants to meet e4 with knight e4. Of course, we cannot allow that, so we go queen b6. Very strong move. And now we are renewing the threat of e4. So probably white has to take on b6, but after the queen trade, e4 is a threat, and also bishop e4 is a threat. And black's position is already preferable here. Interesting stuff. And now let's see b4, which is a blunder actually, but it can be a tempting move. Of course, we don't go back with the knight, but again, tactics work in our favor because of this weak rook on a1. So knight takes e4. This is very beautiful. Knight e4, knight e4, queen e4. And now the point is to go f5, because after the queen moves, we'll play e4 with the double attack on the knight and the rook. Now white has to be very careful what he's playing, because he could be immediately lost. So the lesser evil is to trade the queens with queen h4. But after e4, white has to give back the piece, and he's fighting to keep the game. He's fighting to stay in the game. So black has very easy play, of course. And now let's see bishop g5. White is developing the bishop and is trying to stop our counterplay. Here we can consolidate our knight on c5 with a5. I like this move. Bishop e2. If white goes for g4, we can play c6. So bishop e2 is useful. Bishop d7 is also a useful developing move. We don't want to show our cards just yet. White goes knight d2, preparing g4. And here, of course, c6 is possible, but in correspondence games, b6 was tried. And the idea is to wait and see what white is doing. For example, if castle, then there could be h6 and then to little by little to prepare f5. And if long castle, black can break with c6. g4, white wants to castle long, obviously. And now c6. Now, if white takes on c6, okay, bishop c6, and we'll have the e6 square for the knight. Knight can go knight e6 d4. And otherwise, if white doesn't take on c6, we still have useful moves like a4 or even the rook c8. And the position is unclear. Obviously, all the pieces are on the board. There are chances for both sides. White has a bit more space, but it's a typical King's Indian position. And again, I want to remind you that probably you'll not see this h3 on the board, not in this move order. Okay, so let's recap a little bit. So in this video, we saw White's options at the fifth move instead of e4 or g3, other moves instead of e4 or g3. So both bishop f4 and bishop g5 can be met with bishop f5, and then we have this idea to go knight e4. Black's play is very comfortable, I think, so these moves are easily refuted at once. e3 is White's idea to go for a King's Indian setup. And then we need to be careful not to play bishop f5 at once. First castle, then after bishop e2, we go bishop f5 and we jump knight e4. The same idea, and again, black gets a good play. Finally, if white is very subtle and he knows we want to play with bishop g4, then he can go this h3. And here we can go knight d7 and go for a queen, for a quick e5. The positions are a bit unusual because we didn't castle and we trying to get some concessions from white. But I don't expect you to see this line over the board because white has to play h3 here instead of e4 or g3, which seems very unlikely. Thank you for watching.